Number 10. The Belle Isle Nature Zoo. Belle Isle is an incredibly popular getaway destination for thousands of people from Detroit. They flock here in the summer for picnics, fishing, boating, and swimming. But if you go a little out of your way from the center of the island, you'll come to an overgrown trail where all of the sounds of life fade away. Eventually, you'll reach a rusted chain fence, and beyond that, everything is covered in thickets and grass up to your waist. But it's here where you can find a scene straight out of the apocalypse. Before you know it, you suddenly realize you're standing in the middle of the abandoned Belle Isle Children's Zoo. There are overgrown buildings that have mostly fallen apart, broken children's attractions, and the rusting cages of animals that haven't been used in decades. In 1910, Belle Isle was home to the Detroit Zoo. Tiger cubs, seals, and plenty of elephants made their homes here, but in 1956, the zoo moved to Royal Oak. The location on Belle Isle became a children's zoo. In the 1980s, it was renovated and renamed Safariland. At one point, a bear escaped the zoo and swam across the Detroit River into Canada. After the incident, the bear was released back into the wild. But by 2002, things were not going exceptionally well for Safariland, especially due to lack of interest. People stopped going, and so the zoo was abandoned. Over the past almost 2 decades, the park has remained untouched. It's now a creepy shell of what the grounds used to look like. Number 9. The End of Days Farmhouse. A couple of urban explorers in England discovered the creepiest farmhouse ever. They found this place in Sheffield, and it looks like the last refuge of the last man on Earth. It gives off the energy of the final resting place of a guy who narrowly survived the apocalypse and then drank himself to death. Inside this spooky abandoned farmhouse, they found an enormous stash of X-rated magazines, as well as boxes filled to the brim with booze. The upstairs bedrooms of the farmhouse were filled with empty chicken cages, suggesting somebody had been trying to breed birds. Nobody knows exactly how long the farmhouse has been abandoned. That said, it's probably been empty for a few decades, seeing as the walls are literally falling apart. But what makes the farmhouse extra creepy is that it appears to have been abandoned abruptly. Whoever had been taking refuge in this place left bowls of cereal on the table as if they got up at breakfast and walked away. And in the basement, things get even spookier. The urban explorers found a morgue table that appeared to have been the location where animals were slaughtered. Either that or humans. It's honestly quite hard to tell what happened in this awful place. Number 8. Ghost Town of Fukushima. Fukushima in Japan was devastated by a nuclear disaster a decade ago on March 11, 2011. An earthquake shook the ground, a tsunami crashed into the Fukushima power plant, and there was a nuclear meltdown. Many parts of Fukushima are still off limits. Plus, it's supposed to take about 40 years to decommission the plant because it has millions of gallons of radioactive water still in its storage. The town of Namie was emptied overnight. The full population of 21,000 people was forced to abandon their homes as wind swept radiation into their windows. What resulted is a very real scene from the apocalypse: nuclear disaster, fleeing people, and an abandoned town. Namie has been open now for about 4 years, although only 1,600 residents have moved back home. That means the population is below 90% of what it was at the time of the disaster. One of the people who moved here is Akihiro Zenji, who purchased a house for dirt cheap in 2019 and is planning to start a family. He says life will never return to normal in the town. Most of the residents who were forced to leave will probably never come back. The result of this mass exodus is that a few people still living in the town are almost like a colony repopulating a dead world. There are empty shops, most of the houses are boarded up and decrepit, and there's a very creepy vibe for anyone walking down the street in a city no longer abandoned, but still mostly dead. Number 7. The Pennsylvania Turnpike. The Pennsylvania Turnpike near Breezewood looks like what might happen when all the people just suddenly vanished. It's true that millions of people every year travel across the turnpike through Bedford and Fulton counties, but just a few hundred yards away is one that's abandoned and creepy. It was first created when the highway was rerouted in 1968. The original Pennsylvania Turnpike was a 4-lane highway that only had tunnels with a single lane. This obviously created some huge problems, especially as the population grew and traffic became more and more congested. Larger tunnels were dug next to the existing ones, new turnpikes were made, and this one was left behind. It's now a 13-mile stretch of unused road that's more of a roadside attraction than anything else. It's been used for military training exercises, worker training, and as a movie set. It actually featured in the 2009 post-apocalyptic movie The Road, based on Cormac McCarthy's terrifying novel. If there's anything that really looks like what the rest of American infrastructure will look like at the end of the world, it's the Pennsylvania Turnpike. Just try to walk through its creepy tunnel without having a premonition of disaster. Number 6. Hotel Monte Palace. São Miguel Azores is another one of those places frequented by thousands of tourists every year. It's an island in Portugal, and while the lakes are beautiful, the history is rich, and the landscape is pristine, there are some creepy hidden secrets off the beaten track. One of them is the Monte Palace Hotel, an abandoned facility straight out of the apocalypse. The hotel was built to be a luxurious rest stop for travelers to the island of São Miguel Azores. It was built on the side of a hill to take advantage of the breathtaking views. It opened in 1989 and was a great success, but only for a little while. The island wasn't as popular with tourists as initially thought. The hotel closed almost immediately after it opened and was promptly abandoned. It's still abandoned to this day, although it's become an unofficial tourist destination. There are signs all over the property warning people not to enter, but the parking lot is usually full of curious urban explorers. Inside the building is something you might expect to see in a movie, a horrible future where people are living in massive apartment complexes and everything is run down and dirty. The concrete walls are covered in graffiti, there's moss growing on everything, and it honestly looks as though humans have never lived in it. All 80 rooms are abandoned, with their private balconies smashed and open to the air. The view is still exceptionally beautiful. It's just that the hotel is an ugly, abandoned ruin. Number 5. An abandoned ghost town. Brent Underwood is a resident of the ghost town Cerro Gordo in California. The town opened in 1865 and became a pretty big deal. Over 4,000 miners were living inside the town, which doesn't sound like much, but definitely was for the time period. Back in the days of the Old West, there weren't close to as many people living in California as there are today. But like most mining towns of that era, Cerro Gordo dried up in the 20th century. By 1957, the town was 100% abandoned. Not a single person lived here until the pandemic, when entrepreneur Brent Underwood and his friend John Beer purchased the entire town for $1.4 million. They then decided to live there while the pandemic ravaged the rest of the country. Before they moved in, the ghost town looked like what the world might look like if the apocalypse happened back in the 1800s, and it hasn't changed too much since they've moved in. Brent Underwood has been exploring the place in his spare time, combing through over 30 miles of tunnels underneath the city streets. Some of the deepest mine shafts here are over 1,000 feet down into the earth. He uses climbing equipment and a camera to document his horrifying descent into these spooky caves, like crawling through the abandoned sewers of an apocalypse-struck mining town. What do you think of Brentwood's pandemic purchase and exploration? Would you want to live in an abandoned ghost town? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We've got lots more videos coming up. Number 4. The Kursk Nuclear Power Plant. The Kursk Nuclear Power Plant in Russia isn't creepy in a horror movie type of way. It's more creepy in the fact that it looks like a destroyed power plant barely standing after all-out war. The power plant was supposed to be put in operation in 1992, with construction of its 5th unit beginning in 1986. But by 1989, construction froze. This is because the 5th power unit was designed based on the same type of reactor that was installed at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And we all know how that disaster turned out. Not wanting to have another nuclear meltdown like in Ukraine, the Soviets decided to cut their losses and stop the project. In total, they were between 70 and 90% finished, and just about $1 billion in the hole. There were some talks about continuing the project anyway, But in 2012, when the Fukushima plant had a disaster, Russia decided they would never complete the construction. What remains today is the hollow shell of what almost became a power plant. Creepy, unfinished, there are pipes and rusted chunks of metal everywhere, and it looks like a great place for a serial killer to hide out and hunt teenagers. In fact, it almost looks like the boiler room where Freddy Krueger hangs out in The Nightmare on Elm Street. Number 3. Cairo, Illinois. Cairo is most commonly known as the capital of Egypt. It's also an abandoned town in Illinois that sits on the border of Kentucky and Missouri. It's one of the only places in the U.S. where the entire town is on the National Register of Historic Places. Europeans first came to Cairo in the late 1600s, but it wasn't actually settled until 1702, when French pioneers pushed the Native Americans out of their land and built a fort and a tannery. The Cherokee were pretty upset, so they revolted and killed about 30 or so men who were trying to take their furs to sell at a nearby town. For another 100 years, Cairo was a dangerous place and the location of many squabbles between the Europeans and the Native Americans. The town was finally settled permanently in 1818 when Illinois became a state. A hotel was built here, a shipyard, and warehouses. The railroad was completed in 1853 to connect Cairo with Galena. People even thought Cairo should be the capital of the United States because it was a major hub for steamboats and all kinds of important activities. By the end of the Civil War, things had changed. Cairo was mainly populated now by African Americans. Many had been deposited by the Union Army, while others had run away from the South. There were about 3,000 people that ended up here, but nobody knew what to do with the town. Cargo no longer got unloaded here. The town started to flood so badly that houses were ruined, and in 1909 a mob lynched Will James and murdered him. The town was finally abandoned in the 1970s, but all of the buildings are still there today, at least the ones that haven't been destroyed by flooding. It's now frozen in history, looking like what could have been if the Soviets had bombed America in the Cold War and the whole country was abandoned. Number 2. Pripyat Town. There is no city on Earth quite as apocalyptic as Pripyat. This was the town specifically built for the men and women who were working at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. There were schools, an amusement park, plenty of houses, and it was honestly a pretty nice town. Some even called it a Soviet paradise. But within 36 hours of the nuclear blast at Chernobyl, the worst nuclear disaster in human history, all 49,000 residents were evacuated, and nobody has come back since. It's been more than 30 years since the devastation, and Pripyat still looks like a scene from the apocalypse. Scientists say the radioactivity will make Pripyat dangerous and uninhabitable for 24,000 years. By then, the ruined buildings, broken sports stadiums, and cracked streets will have been returned to nature, and there will be no sign that Pripyat ever existed. Number 1. Prehistoric Forest Amusement Park. The Prehistoric Forest was an amusement park and roadside attraction established in 1963 in Michigan. It was really the quintessential roadside attraction. It lured tourists with fiberglass dinosaurs, a fake volcano, and a giant water slide over 400 feet tall. For those who were driving through Michigan and saw the dinosaurs rearing their heads out of the trees on the side of the highway, it probably felt like a fantasy. There were waterfalls, statues of cavemen, and interactive pits where kids could dig for fossils. That sounds fun. But business began to slip in the 1980s. By 2002, when kids had video games to play, the dinosaur park was no longer necessary. Nobody wanted to visit it anymore, and the park was abandoned. Time has not been friendly to this place. The dinosaurs have eroded, vandals have destroyed most of the attractions, and some of the statues even ended up on the roof of a local high school in 2010. It now looks like a roadside attraction that was lost at the end of the war, like some weird location you accidentally discover while searching for scrap in the post-apocalyptic wasteland of America. Which of these creepy places would you hide in to ride out the apocalypse? Let me know in the comments below, and thanks for watching! To see even more awesome videos, check out more stuff from the channel, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. See you later! Bye!